All right, I want to thank everyone for gathering here. We've been doing this now for a year and a half, more or less every month, the Metropolitan Theodosius Memorial Lecture Series. I want to thank Dr. John Burgess here. He's from Pittsburgh Theological Academy, where he teaches, among other things, about Russian Orthodoxy to primarily Protestant student body. And he's going to speak with us today about the lives of certain holy elders of the later imperial and Soviet periods, if I understand correctly. And especially, at least I understand it from the blurb and from what John Thompson told me, you're going to be speaking about how these holy elders helped Russian Orthodoxy to be maintained in the midst of some serious Soviet persecution. So we thank you for being here. I thank you for all coming. Thank John Thompson for organizing it as always. And without further ado, John.
Thank you very much, Father John, for your warm introduction. Thank you, John Thompson, for inviting me and organizing. Thanks to all of you for attending this evening. As Father John mentioned, I'm a Protestant. I teach at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. But for more than 20 years, I've been going back and forth to Russia. I've also been to Ukraine. And actually had 3 sabbaticals in Russia. So 1 year in St. Petersburg in 2004 to 5, and then in Moscow 2011 to 12. Most recently 2018 to 19 in a city, mid-sized city more to the south, close to the Ukrainian border, called Belgorod. My wife Deb is with us tonight, and she's been with me on all of those ventures, so you can also ask her about some of her perspectives. Part of the upshot of our getting to know Russia and getting to know Orthodoxy is that, while the Protestant is stubbornly Protestant, my wife converted to Orthodoxy, thanks to our many trips to Russia, as well, of course, as the call of the Lord, and she's very active at St. Nicholas and McKees Rocks. So what I'd like to do tonight is talk to you a little bit about the research that I've been doing, going back now, as I say, for more than 20 years. This is a great opportunity for me to begin to pull together some of the material that I've been working on, trying to understand. I've come to have, of course, a very deep appreciation of Orthodoxy, and since when I'm in Russia, we're always involved in an Orthodox parish there to the extent that we can be. So often I will be in Orthodox liturgy or worship 3-4 times a week. And at one point I began to add up all the hours, and I think 3 years of regular Orthodox worship in Russia is about equivalent to the amount I've had over a lifetime in a Presbyterian church. Lots of time immersing myself into Orthodoxy. As Father John said, I'd like to talk tonight about the holy elders, the tradition of holy eldership in Orthodoxy, how that blossomed again in Russia, first in the 19th century, then again at several points in the 20th century. And what interests me is this capacity of these people, like other saints, although these particular figures have not yet been canonized, but this ability to nurture freedom even under the conditions of political repression. This inner spirit of spiritual resistance that they cultivated and for which they became known. So thinking about the words of our scriptures, what the Apostle Paul says in a couple of places. For example, in Galatians 1, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand fast, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Or again in 2 Corinthians, "Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." That's the kind of freedom that we want to think about, not simply political freedom, but this inner spiritual freedom that keeps a person firmly in the Lord, no matter what kind of society you live in. This was, of course, especially important under the conditions of communist totalitarianism, where the communists tried to eliminate any worldview other than their own. It was the witness of the martyrs and the spiritual elders that enabled the church to survive and then to blossom again institutionally after the fall of communism in 1991. The elders that I'm going to talk about started to emerge in the late 50s and early 60s. And as we'll see, that's a very interesting time in the history of the Soviet Union because the period of martyrdom had largely passed. The martyrdom was at its peak in the 1930s. And then under Stalin, who initially had been the great persecutor of the church, there was a turn of fortune. After the Nazis invaded Russia, there was some relaxation of anti-religious policies. But then again, under Khrushchev, another anti-religious period of propaganda. And it was interesting to me that these holy elders emerged at a time that martyrdom was past. You know, when you have martyrs, you still have heroes to look to. But in a sense, the government was so cunning that it didn't even want martyrs anymore. It just wanted to push the church relentlessly to the margins. There were no longer great heroes of the faith. Martyrdom was past. The church was largely under the thumb of the KGB and state authorities. Under those conditions, it was especially significant that these spiritual elders emerged, showing a different way forward for the church. Let me say a few things about the general history of spiritual eldership in Orthodoxy. Of course, it goes back to the first monks. If we think about St. Anthony, who I hope some of you, maybe all of you, I can recommend that you read someday Athanasius's short biography of St. Anthony. It's really marvelous. But the first great monk goes off by himself as a hermit into the wilderness, but he becomes renowned for his spiritual wisdom. And pretty soon, interested monks are coming out to get his counsel, and soon there are settlements of monks growing up around his cell. And then lay people are coming and asking for advice. So this is also one of the ironies about spiritual eldership. Holy people don't want to be bothered, but people keep coming to them because they want to benefit from their spiritual depth. And then in the 5th century, we have the holy saint, Saint Simeon Stylites, another kind of hermit elder on a high pillar who is, from our thinking today, a very odd, strange person, but again, attracted people who wanted to learn from him, to help him adjudicate their everyday problems. So these are the origins of this notion of eldership, that there are certain people who are so devoted to the Lord, so focused on God, and so disciplined that over time they develop this spiritual depth that somehow attracts people. They are curious about it. They want to come close to it. They want to receive the spiritual power that these elders seem to possess. But for later generations, what began to happen was that eldership moved into the monasteries. Even though it had this popular element with Anthony and Simeon, then for several centuries, eldership was largely a more mundane matter. It came to be a matter of the monasteries where an older monk, would be a spiritual guide to a younger monk, help to introduce a novice or a new monk into the spiritual life. So we fast forward then, come to Russia in the 19th century. There's a blossoming of holy eldership, but it takes on a new form. It's no longer simply located in the monasteries. It's no longer simply an older monk counseling, guiding a younger monk. In the 19th century in Russia, we have this phenomenon of certain monks who become renowned for their spiritual wisdom, and like Antony and like Simeon, attract lay people. These are holy elders who are able to speak into the world. One of the first great Russian spiritual elders who is beloved in Russian Orthodoxy, really one of the two most beloved saints in Russian Orthodoxy, next to Saint Sergius of Radonezh, is Saint Seraphim of Sarov. You undoubtedly know about some of his feats, praying on a rock over the course of 1,000 days, his great asceticism, again, for many years a hermit. At one point, robbers came out to his hermitage, they beat him up and took what little he had. He was renowned for how little food he could live on. But at some point, after these many years of spiritual development, he decided to return to the main monastery in Sarov, and people began to come to him. They found some kind of spiritual wisdom and power, even power to heal. This became one of the phenomena of Russian Orthodox spiritual eldership. This spiritual wisdom, this ability to look into other people's lives, a kind of clairvoyance, a kind of ability to read what was in a person's heart before that person even spoke, sometimes to heal, the power of prayer, and especially with saints like Saint Seraphim, this love, this all-embracing love for every human being and for all creation. Next slide. A bit later in the 19th century, we have a succession of holy elders at this very renowned monastery, Optina-Pustin, in Russia. And again, although located in a monastery, as Seraphim of Sarov was, people came. People wanted their counsel. People, the great novelists and artists of that time in Russia came to Optina-Pustin for the guidance of spiritual elders. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gogol, and others came to this monastery. So some of the holy elders of Optina-Pustin, who have been in the meantime canonized, Ambrosi, that were literally translated. Next. Anatoly, another one of the great Optina elders. And then yet another phenomenon of holy eldership that was in a parish priest, St. John of Kronstadt, also in the meantime canonized. He was not a monk, and yet seemed to possess the same kinds of spiritual gifts that had manifested themselves in Seraphim of Sarov or in the elders of Optina-Pustin. Again, these gifts of clairvoyance, healing, wisdom, love, miracles. Very powerful figure, but very much in the world. And that's what became distinctive about this movement of holy eldership in the 19th century in Russia. It it had monastic figures, but it was moving more and more into the world to touch people, to touch parishioners, to give guidance to not just other monks, but to all believers seeking spiritual guidance. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 brings complete change of fortunes for the Russian Orthodox Church. We know clearly from history that the Bolsheviks from the outset were determined to destroy the church. They saw all religion, but especially Orthodoxy, being the principal religion of the Russian Empire, they saw all religion as an alternative worldview that had to be eliminated in favor of materialistic Marxism. So, beginning in 1917, the destruction of churches, the closing of monasteries, arrests, martyrdom. Within a year after the Bolshevik Revolution, more than 100 Orthodox bishops and priests had been martyred. And that would only accelerate over the next years. We now know that several 100,000 monastics and priests suffered for their faith by execution or imprisonment in the Gulag. We think that probably up to 90% of the clergy and the monastics were arrested and most of them killed. This is the Church of Christ, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, which by Stalin's orders was blown up, was razed in 1931. But this dramatic symbol of the effort to eradicate religion. The communists tried to destroy the church not only from without, but also from within. So there were various sectarian, secessionist movements within the church, the renovationists, who tried to split the church. And then for much of the church's life, a controversial leader, Metropolitan Theodosius, who worked out a kind of compromise with the state. The church could exist, but it would have to be under control of the government. And that really became the modus operandus over the next decades, sometimes the church coming closer to total elimination, as was the case by 1939, but then later a little bit more relaxation. Some parishes could open again, some monasteries, but this relentless pressure on the church. So, next slide, please. It was after the Bolshevik Revolution and the beginning of this relentless persecution of the church that we have another generation of spiritual elders. One of the best known is this man, a Moscow priest, Alexei Betchov. He himself was a spiritual child of the Optinopustin elders. This is also an interesting feature of spiritual eldership, this lineage that one elder passes his wisdom and spiritual power to another generation. But he was a parish priest like St. John of Kronstadt. His parish, he could see the writing on the wall that his parish was going to be closed, that it would be destroyed. And he decided to strengthen his parishioners, to make them ready for that day of persecution. He divided them into house circles, taught them how to chant the prayers secretly at home. He instructed them how they could invite priests secretly to come to celebrate liturgy, how they could read the scriptures together. So all of the spiritual strengthening for the day that he might no longer be with them. But they would carry his wisdom with them. He died of natural causes in 1923, and then his son, Sergei Betchov, took over the parish. The same hope, the same commitment, make the people strong so that they're able to survive the persecution. Next slide. Saint Sergius was, Sergius Machild himself was then arrested and sent to the Gulag. Besides the very famous Optina-Puszta, there were other monasteries that cultivated eldership during the Soviet period. Here's one that is now in what is Ukraine, the Glinskaya Houston, also a famous center of holy eldership. Next slide. And these are the last of the spiritual elders. Glinskaya Houston was able to hold out for a long time. You can see the date on this photograph is 1958, so the last photograph of the monks and elders before the monastery was closed for good. Many of these men had to flee to the Caucasus and hide basically in the mountains, far away from Moscow and the centers of political power. But even then, sometimes their spiritual children would come out to visit them. It's an amazing story about, for example, Sergei Metyov. He was in the Gulag, but spiritual children would come to visit him. They would travel hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 miles out to a concentration camp, bring letters to him, take letters from him back to these underground house circles. So this communication with the elders that continued, and also spiritual children who went out to the Caucasus after Glinskaya Houston was closed. All right, well, as I say, the Stalinist era was both the height of repression, but also the point where there was a relaxation of anti-religious policy in 1941 because of the Nazi invasion. Stalin wanted to win the support of the Russian people. He saw the church as a tool in whipping up Russian patriotism, defense of the fatherland, and so he relaxed his policies. In 1939, just to give you an example here, in 1939 there were probably only 200 or 300 churches still functioning in all of the Soviet Union. By the end of the Stalinist era, by the end of the war, and then Stalin until his death in 1953, but by that point there were about 5,000 parishes again. So you can see the dramatic change in fortunes over those last years of Stalin's leadership. But Stalin dies in 1953. Then Nikita Khrushchev comes to power, and Khrushchev was very much wanting to reform the Soviet Union, to do away with the personality cult of Stalin. He released many political prisoners. He also released many religious prisoners, including people, as we see, who would come to be known as spiritual elders. The price that the church paid, as I say, for having some kind of legal existence under Metropolitan Sergius, the price for that was close control by state officials and the KGB. The holy elders who began to emerge during the Khrushchev era were typically priests. They'd been ordained. They had suffered in the Gulag and then been released by Khrushchev. They received parishes again, but in faraway villages and monastic settlements far from the centers of power. And that's what I want to point out by this map. These red circles are places where spiritual eldership began to emerge in the late 50s and the 1960s. you can see that most of them are in the countryside. They're far away from the centers of power in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Caucasus and Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and southwestern Russia on the border with the Baltics. And then even though the circles in the middle appear to be closer to Moscow, those are very rural areas. Very hard to actually make your way to or from Moscow because the road systems even today are not terribly good in that area. So they could emerge and become a spiritual force, but only because they were not seen as a threat to the state. The official church, pretty much under control of the state, but these little pockets of spiritual freedom far from the centers of power. Again, what characterized these elders who began to emerge in the late Khrushchev period? Some of the same characteristics as we've seen before. This clairvoyance, this ability to look into a person, their power of prayer, their miracles, including healings. They also were known for extraordinary love, for not judging people and yet guiding people into the way of Christ. I've had an opportunity when I was doing my research to meet, of course, not these spiritual elders themselves, but some of their spiritual children. One of the refrains is how extraordinarily loving people felt in the presence of these men, that they were surrounded, embraced by the love of God in Jesus Christ. During the Soviet period, that was particularly important that there were examples of Christian living. If you couldn't trust your parish priest, because again, most of the parish priests had been appointed by state officials. They were not well trained theologically. They were really functionaries. They perhaps performed the basic necessary religious rituals, but they were not known as men of spiritual depth. If you wanted to find someone who seemed to live like Christ, who was fearless in his faith, who was disciplined, who loved the liturgy, who was a real pastor, then people seeking that deeper spirituality that they couldn't find in their home parish under the thumb of the state, they'd make the long trek from Moscow or St. Petersburg or other cities to these spiritual elders in these remote places. So here are several of the elders of that generation. Historians say that there were maybe as many as 70 people known for their spiritual eldership, but the ones that I'm going to share with you are the ones who became most well known and attracted the largest numbers of spiritual children. So Ioann Krest'iankin, John Krest'iankin, John Thompson and I were talking about this. Some of you may have read the book Ordinary Saints by Archimandrite, he's now a Metropolitan, Tikhon Shevkunov. In Russia, he was a spiritual child of Ioann Krest'iankin. Ioann Krest'iankin had been sent to the Gulag, was released under Khrushchev, served for a time as a parish priest, and then eventually became a monk in the famous Pskov monastery of the caves. The only monastery that was in the entire Russian part of the Soviet Union for many years. Not far from him was this spiritual elder. Also, many spiritual children of his still live today. Nikolai Kodyanov. By the way, you can see they in Russian, the term for a holy elder is a starets, and it basically means an old man. And these did live to be really old men, which is remarkable when you think that during the Soviet period, the average lifetime of a male was under 60 years of age. And here you have people like Ioann Krest'iankin or Nikolai Kodyanov who, live into their 90s. So this was extraordinary, not just that they lived so long, of course that was extraordinary, but also had all of this accumulated wisdom and experience that they so lovingly shared with other people. Tavrion Batozskii, another very well-known Russian elder. Not all of these are well-known outside of Russia, but if you were to go to Russia today, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to do for a while because of the horrendous circumstances that are engulfing our world, but if you were to go into a bookstore in Moscow, you would find books with sermons or the accounts of spiritual children of these famous spiritual elders. Holy Rus, who was in a rural area north of Moscow, place I've also visited. So all the places where these people, many of the places where these people lived, I've had the privilege of visiting. But the man I want to talk about specifically for a few minutes about is Seraphim Tiapochkin, to give you a little more detail about one holy elder and what he was like. He was born in 1894 in what is now actually Poland, later became part of Ukraine. His baptismal name was Dmitri. He entered the Moscow Theological Academy in 1917, but unfortunately could study there only for a few months before the academy was closed by the Bolsheviks. He returned to Ukraine, became a school teacher, married, was then ordained and became priest in a small village. His first two sons died in the late 1920s and early 1930s from famine. As you may know from history, there were terrible famines in parts of Ukraine and southern Russia during those years. And in 1931, his wife died of tuberculosis. So already this life of extreme suffering and loss. In 1936, the Bolsheviks closed his parish, and Father Seraphim was forced to work. The only work he could find was in a warehouse, where he would work during the days, but in the evenings secretly celebrate the liturgy in people's houses. In 1941, he was accused of counter-revolutionary activity and sent to the Gulag, leaving behind 3 teenage daughters. He was sentenced to 10 years. 1951, he's getting ready for release. The commandant of the concentration camp calls him in. Father Seraphim had managed all this time to stay out of trouble, had secretly celebrated the liturgy as he could with the other prisoners, had been a tutor to the commandant's children. So moving between these different worlds with this sense of inner strength. But the commandant said to him, Dmitri, who was still Dmitri at that time, Dmitri, what are you going to do when you're released? Your release is coming up in a couple of months. And it said that Dmitri turned to the commandant and said, I'm a priest. I'm going to serve as a priest. And the commandant said, then you get 5 more years in the Gulag. So he was sent back to the Gulag, And again, it was not because of Khrushchev coming to power. Then he was released in 1955, finally released from the concentration camp. He returned to Ukraine, but because of state restrictions, he was not given a parish. State authorities would not allow him to serve as a priest again. In total dejection, he went to Moscow to see the patriarch and to plead for a parish. He waited for days because the line of people to see the patriarch was very long. It was said that at night, Dmitri would sleep in the train station, and then during the day come back to the office of the patriarch hoping to see him. On one of those visits to the office, he ran, just by God's grace, got to know Metropolitan Leonid, Metropolitan in the southern area, the Diocese of Belgorod, and Metropolitan Leonid said, I will assign you to a parish. So in 1960, he was assigned to a parish. In 1961, he asked for tonsure as a monk and asked to be named after Seraphim of Sarov, whom he had loved since his childhood. And then that year was appointed to the St. Nicholas Church in a small town, a village of 4,000 or 5,000 named Rakitna, which is in that Belgorod area where my wife and I were 2018 to 19, only about 15 miles from the Ukrainian border. He began restoration work. The St. Nicholas Church had been left half ruined, had not had a priest for many years. But not only did he rebuild the church, he rebuilt the people. So here you can see him with some of his spiritual children as he became known for his spiritual wisdom. People from all over Russia would come to visit him. Ordinary people, metropolitans, men, women, the elderly, children. That was one of the striking things about these holy elders, that they were there for every human being. They were not there for just one group or another. Some of the stories that people tell about Father now Seraphim, some of the stories are half humorous, but he loved the liturgy. He loved celebrating the liturgy. He so loved it that he would speak every word distinctly. He wouldn't abbreviate any of the liturgy. It proceeded very slowly and deliberately. It sometimes could take 4 hours or longer. And there were people who were missing the last bus back to Belgorod and pleaded with him to shorten the liturgy so that they could come on a Sunday morning but still get back to their city to be able to work on Monday morning. He was reputed to be a very powerful preacher. There was something about his own spiritual charisma that touched people. It's said that sometimes he would preach and he would start crying. And then the people in front of him would start crying. And soon the whole parish was crying, so moved by his declaration of God with us. God is with us. God is here. God has been born to us in Jesus Christ. His spiritual powers, known for his healings. There's stories of people seeing him levitate in the altar area. The spiritual counsel and guidance that he could give to people. Whenever he wasn't in prayer in his cell or not celebrating worship in the church, he was receiving visitors. As many, again, just as he had once lined up hoping to see the patriarch, now people were lining up to receive his blessing and guidance. It said in the summertime that people would actually camp out on the grounds of the parish, waiting, hoping for their opportunity to have a few minutes with the elder. Another picture of Father Seraphim with his spiritual children. I think I'm just so moved by these pictures, I guess in part because Deb and I have lived in Russia. We have seen the descendants of these people. We know what life is like in small villages and remote areas. It can be very hard. People are poor. A lot of people in Russia and Ukraine in the small villages are very poor people. And he had such a deep heart, such a deep love for all of those who came to him. Here, just a few months before his death in 1982, these photographs perhaps give you some sense of this being a very special, this being an extraordinary person of great spiritual depth. When I asked people, well, how did the government allow for this? How could this go on, that the government didn't intervene and close down, hundreds of people coming to visit him, especially for the big holidays, Christmas and Pascha. And I was told that the local, the director of the local communal farm had said, Father Seraphim is one of ours. Now, Deb will appreciate this, but in Russia, when you say, that person is one of ours, that's a very, very powerful statement. That's basically what we would say in English, you don't mess with him. He's one of ours. So even though this director was an atheist, was not a churchgoer, somehow Father Seraphim, what was it? Was it that even under the conditions of political repression, there's still in the Soviet people, Russian people, was this deep sense, this deep intuition of respecting holiness when it would appear. But when he died in 1982, state officials were concerned about the huge crowds that began to take buses and trains to come to the village, and they actually canceled much of the bus service so that attendance at the funeral would be limited. This is the church where he served. In the meantime, nicely renovated, serving still as a parish church. You can see the renovations that took place under Father Seraphim, famous iconographer, icon painter who did the murals and some of the icons on the iconostasis. Yeah, so I think that may be it. Oh no, okay, thank you. This is his cell, which is now a kind of museum. Visitors can come, they can enter into the space, they can see the books, prayer books that he once used, the icons that were his, the bed in which he slept. I had the privilege, the priest who now heads the parish invited me to come and live in the cell for 3 days. Extraordinary experience to live in the shadow of Seraphim. And now his grave next to the church. People come every day and pray here and ask Seraphim Tiapochkin to pray for them. He's still very much a living presence for his spiritual children and even for people who never met him. So when I was living in the cell, I'd look out the window, and there was a constant stream. People on their way to work would stop here, cross themselves, kiss the cross, say a prayer. School kids coming home after school would deliberately come through the churchyard to pay homage to Seraphim. One of his spiritual children, the man who did some of the icons of the church, is Father Zenon Theodor, the most famous icon painter today in Russia, one of the spiritual children of Seraphim. Father Zenon, I had the opportunity to interview. He said, I asked Father Zenon, what was it like to be around Father Seraphim? And Father Zenon said, I can't describe it. You just had to be next to him. He had this, again, as we said, of all these elders, extraordinary love, compassion, freedom. He'd been through so much. He'd lost 2 children in the famine. He'd lost a wife to tuberculosis. He had lost his parish. He'd been in the gulag. He couldn't find a new parish until many years later with the help of Metropolitan Theodosius. Who could do anything to him? Through all of that, he'd not been broken, but he had found this inner freedom, this inner strength to persist. He wasn't a political opponent. He wasn't a dissident in that sense, but he was free in a way that the Bolsheviks did not want people to be free, but they didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't trying to overthrow the government, but he was different. He had this different source of power. Another of his spiritual children for a time was this prominent Moscow priest, Father Vladimir Volgan. There's some we would regularly attend his parish the year we were in Moscow, and he's actually the priest who said to my wife one day,
in 2006, I was visiting his parish with a friend before I converted, and they took me into that. There's a gate church, a church over the gate. I was introduced, and he said, well, when you become Orthodox, I'll baptize you.
So the process turned out to be half true. He didn't baptize you, but he knew that you were going to become Orthodox. Okay. So just what can we learn from this for today? Well, Holy Eldership does continue in Russia today. The most well-known Holy Elder is this man, Eli. But most people would say Holy Eldership now is in a period of decline. It doesn't have the prominence, the power, the charismatic figures that it once had. Seems like this is the history of eldership. There are periods of dormancy and periods of renewal. But we're left with these words by another of Father Seraphim's spiritual children that perhaps will also be an inspiration to us. Living in an unfree land, Father Seraphim was its freest person because he knew and loved the truth and continually served it. Nothing could take this truth from him. With Christ, he was free, everywhere and at all times. That, I believe, is our calling as Christians, whether we are in Russia or Ukraine or the United States, to discover the freedom of the Holy Elders. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
So were any of these elders political, did they have any political opposition to the government, the Bolsheviks?
They tended not to speak about politics because they thought the best witness was this spiritual freedom. If you could stay free spiritually, that itself was offering an alternative to the Marxist worldview. So they never tried to organize politically, but the state was always ambivalent. It put them out into these faraway, remote rural areas because it also knew they had some kind of power. And so the state was very ambivalent. It didn't have, it couldn't, if they'd listened to Father Seraphim, well, there always were informers, but it was not like Father Seraphim's sermons were directly anti-Soviet. But he was talking about a spiritual reality, and Marxism denied any spiritual reality. So in that sense, it was very political, but not in an organized political way. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. And there were, you may have heard of the famous priest at the end of the Soviet period, Alexander Min. Alexander Min was also very much inspired by these holy elders. His family had connections to the elders at Metropolitan Houston. And Min was, some people, he was killed, he was murdered, and some people think it was murder at the hands of the KGB because he becomes so, he was not directly anti-Soviet, but he was talking about freedom, he was talking about the spiritual life, things that the authorities thought could get out of hand.
I'm not sure of timelines, but how about Solzhenitsyn? Was he connected with any of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So of course Solzhenitsyn is also living through this period, the 50s, the 60s, also had suffered in the Gulag, also thought a lot about spiritual freedom and how the Gulag, he himself believed the Gulag had taught him a great deal about freedom. Solzhenitsyn, is exiled then to the United States in, I don't have the year right at the tip of my tongue, but then once he, late 60s, once he's outside of the United States, he becomes much more directly political and critical of the Soviet Union in what he writes. Of course, he had to leave. He was exiled because he was starting to become critical. But in a different, there's someone who is an interesting instance. For him, spiritual freedom meant you had to agitate for political freedom. And that's a very interesting question. What is the relationship between spiritual freedom and political freedom? So these holy elders didn't want to go that far.
Well, I was in college and read that. We had to read his letters to the Soviet leaders.
Yeah.
And I still remember.
Yeah. Yeah, he was very controversial in Russia. Some people felt he'd become too political, that he was turning spiritual freedom into political freedom. And the first task of an Orthodox believer is not to obsess about political arrangements, but the condition of your own soul. So it's a very complicated question, but it's a very, very good point. And I think to this day, we're trying to understand, what does spiritual freedom mean or not mean for the way one engages in politics.
Were any of the elders or priests or bishops accused of cooperating with the communists in order to help the church survive?
No, not these. These are the people who really stood outside the system. So another way to get your questions to say, just as the state had an ambivalent attitude about them, the church hierarchs had an ambivalent attitude about these holy elders because they didn't let themselves come under the control of the state hierarchy. They were loyal to the church, but they also insisted on their own freedom. And I suspect this is an enduring tension within Orthodoxy between the hierarchy and certain spiritual figures. There's,
The reason I ask is our Metropolitan Theodosius, on one of his visits, he told me he was in the car with patriarch, I believe it's Nikon, the patriarch before Alexei, and they were taught, who was it? Nikon, yeah. And he said that, the patriarch Nikon said that he was accused of that. Then he lifted up his cassock and showed Metropolitan Theodosius. He had so many scars on his legs that the KGB beat him, you know? And,
Well, yes, I see what you're getting at. So, of course, to be a hierarch during those years was dreadful.
yeah.
And it is true, most of them were registered as informers, but that was part of the job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, doesn't mean that you did a real question that would have to be investigated. Did you betray anyone?
Well,
That's a much more complicated question.
That was the point. He said,
Right.
I didn't betray the church.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right, that's right. But they were under pressures that Father Seraphim or Ioann Krest'iankin really didn't have to deal with. They were, again, sort of these solitary figures, much freer, not having to deal with state officials all the time. So, but yes, you know, it's a good question about the spiritual freedom that a hierarch is called to cultivate.
So what are the views on the patriarch that was cooperating with the government? You know, he put the church under them. What are the views on him today?
Well, if I wanted to put it crudely, let me see how I can put it politely. If you're a fan of current church-state relations in Russia, you tend to be sympathetic to Metropolitan Sergius. If you're a critic of current church-state relations in Russia, you tend to be critical of him. But it's back to the same question that you all are suggesting. When is cooperation necessary to save the church? At what price? When does one have to refuse and take a different path, even the path of martyrdom? And then you have these spiritual elders who suffered under the system and said, well, look, I'm now getting, I'm not a status, but I am getting to be an old man. Now, it probably comes with age that you do say, the heck with it. I'm going to have my integrity. And that's what was interesting about these spiritual elders. You can't do anything more to me that hasn't already been done.
So are you familiar with the books from St. Vladimir Seminary Press on Father Arseny?
Yes, I've read that book, yeah.
But I understand that there is some controversy about his historicity.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that? Can you address that?
So, right, the first holy elder who became kind of widely known in the West was this Father Arseny. First biography in Russian, composed by spiritual children or a spiritual child, and then translated into English, as you'd say, published by St. Vladimir's, became read by a lot of people. But then, as historians began to do further research, there were problems in the account. There were things that historically didn't add up. There were details that seemed to not jive with the years that he was said to have been in the Gulag. For example, there's a description of the Gulag that he was in, and there were guard towers that resembled the guard towers that the Nazis were using. Well, it's an accurate description of a concentration camp at a different period in Soviet history than the period that Father Arseny was supposedly in the camp. So today, historians think it's probably a compilation of stories, maybe about several different spiritual leaders, maybe not one person, maybe not one Father Arseny, but someone compiled these accounts of true courage under the Gulag, but maybe there's not as such a Father Arseny. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to, historical, about the bishops who were struggling is that, one of the reasons that these elders could be free is that they didn't have anyone really, any church people under them that they were responsible for. One of the reasons that the bishops kind of had to go along with it is that if they didn't play ball with the state, all of their parishes would be closed. And so the compromise was, if I play ball with the government, my people can continue to worship.
That's
If I
right.
don't play ball, my priest will be sent to the gulags, and the parish will be closed.
Yeah.
And so it's really, I mean, it's a lot easier when you just have
Yeah.
a priest versus a bishop. You know?
That's right, and it's very complicated, isn't it? I think people are called to different roles in the life of the church, and also the church under the life of repression. The calling of a bishop is going to be different from the calling of a holy elder, but we need these different callings, not one alone. One of the dangers, so maybe to add to your point, be a real danger to romanticize the holy elders and say, well, you know, they were the true church. But your point is quite right. You know, the church, the wholeness of the church are different people playing different roles, sometimes in tension, but also in support, and that would be a much more accurate and nuanced picture.
What does playing ball with the government entail in that period?
Okay, so in that period, to go to seminary, you had to be vetted by the state. So the state determined who could go to seminary. Once you graduated from seminary, the state determined whether you would be appointed and where you would be appointed. So the best and the brightest did not go to seminary. They were not allowed to go to seminary. The best and the brightest that came out of seminary were not sent into city parishes, but were put into small rural parishes. You had informants in your congregation. The state discouraged preaching, just wanted to reduce the function of a priest to liturgical actions. So chanting the liturgy, performing baptisms in the church. Everything was supposed to take place within the church building. Mostly, rituals and even baptism, there was a lot of discouragement by the state, discouraged parents from bringing their children for baptism. For example, if you brought a child to be baptized, the priest was supposed to register that and tell state officials. So there was a great deal of control of who could become a priest and what a priest had to do, how a priest was paid, had to come from the parish. A certain amount of the parish budget had to be given to the state as a kind of tax. Priests were heavily taxed. So there were many mechanisms to try to reduce priests to kind of mere mechanical ritual activity.
So, this is just my speculation, but, you know, under communism, when you have a surveillance state, and where there is a pervasive climate of fear and betrayal, and just a lack of trust, do you think that the contrast with that these holy elders provided sort of maybe even opened the door even wider to people being interested in their ministries?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was such a contrast.
Yes. That's a very accurate contrast. As I say, you were afraid that you're struggling to know, I don't know, you're at work, you're supposed to go to the May 1st parade, or you're supposed to put a banner in front of your house supporting the state, or you're not going, you're afraid of having your child baptized, and so you come to your parish priest. And you couldn't, as I say, the parish priest was supposed to report a lot of things to the state. So there was this fear, distrust. I cannot trust my parish priest to give me true counsel. The parish priest himself may not have been a very good example of living the Christian faith, was kind of a functionary and not much more beyond that, not a person of spiritual depth. And so, yes, to find one of these if you were serious about developing your spirituality, you long for what you found in these spiritual elders, where there was this atmosphere of freedom. spiritual children would gather, these spiritual families. And there was this joy, this freedom, this love, community that they weren't finding, they couldn't find in their home parish because of the fearfulness. Typically, the pattern, there was no parish life under Soviet communism. Again, all that was left were a few rituals. People would come to church, maybe, they weren't afraid of losing their jobs, and they'd go home. There was no coffee hour, there was no Sunday school, there was no social work, there was no fellowship hour. So, yes, indeed, I think that was why people were so attracted to these little islands where something was different. We had a friend who started a drug rehabilitation center in St. Petersburg, and she had spent several summers going out to Tavrion Batozskii that I had on screen earlier. And she said, it was just wonderful to be able to breathe spiritual air again, to gather with other people and not be afraid, and to be able to trust each other and support each other and care for each other. So that was a very, very powerful experience.
So that leads me into my next question, the state of the church today.
Yeah.
In your opinion?
Well, mixed. It's a mixed bag. It's in some ways what we said about, the Putin government is very authoritarian. So if you're a bishop, you're a hierarch, you don't want your church to be destroyed, but how far can you go in cooperation? It's excruciating circumstance. They're not really holy elders today, so they're not places where people can go to get that kind of spiritual guidance, but there are particular parishes that there's much more opportunity for strong parish life than there was during the communist era. So there are parishes that, in fact, some of them inspired by the example of the holy elders, priests who are spiritual children of the holy elders, who now are trying to shape their parishes to have real fellowship, real mutuality, real mutual care. So, at the higher levels, it's really always complicated, but if you look at particular priests and particular parishes, there's some beautiful things happening. Mm-hmm.
My understanding, and please, I don't want to speak either confirmation or correction. My understanding is that currently under the Putin regime in Russia, the parishes are able to function in a fully vibrant way, and as long as you don't preach on anything political, especially against the state, you're more or less able to function with a full spiritual, liturgical life.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think that's generally true, but then a lot depends on who your bishop is, who your priest is. The Russian priest once said to me, but this was several years ago, before things have gotten even more authoritarian, but he said, since the fall of communism, we've had more freedom than we've ever had as a church. The question is, will we use it? And I think this is the dilemma. Will we use it or will we be afraid? So, there's a lot that's possible in parishes, but as any parish priest knows, building parish life, bringing people together, especially in Russia, after 75 years of atheism, where people, we're not used to, it's still very typical in Russia that people, their attitude to church is, I go, I get the Eucharist, I go back home, and I've kind of fulfilled my duty. It's hard, for priests to get beyond that and to say, we really are a family here. And to receive Eucharist means we also have responsibilities for one another. So it's always a challenge, I think, of parish life. But in general, I would say, yeah, as long as you're not talking about directly politics, you know, as long as you don't preach against the war in Ukraine, you're probably going to be left alone. Back to our question, if you're spiritually free, what does that mean in the way that you think about political events? You speak, not speak, how do you determine that?
I'd just like to put in a plug for your book, Holy Rus. So he's written a book. I think it's from Oxford. Is that from Oxford?
Yale University
Yale
Press.
University Press. Yeah, and John paints a picture of contemporary Russian church life, and I haven't quite finished. I've got about 3/4 of it through. But what I really appreciated about your book is the way that you talk about the struggle between, is it good enough to be a nominal Orthodox Christian, and because the number of people who are really truly devout are in the minority.
Right. So 70+% of Russians identify themselves as Orthodox. In a city such as Moscow, fewer than 1% regularly participate in church life. So the same thing, yeah, maybe a parish is free to do stuff, but it's a hard thing to get people to come.
But it's a very fascinating look, and I think the way you address it are things that the Orthodox Church in this country has too. You know, sort of issues of nominalism. You know, and you really wrestle, I think, with maybe a Protestant's eyes, with the issue of the relation of church to culture. But it's very, very stimulating what you do. So I really highly recommend you go to your local library and get a copy of it.
Well, you have to order one copy for your book display.
We'll do that.
The library.
We'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final questions?
Great, well, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
So did you ever